to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth.
Well, hello, you good people, and welcome to Life on Earth with Robert and Amy Nasir, and you in the chat, you out there in podcast world, wherever you are listening to this show. We are glad you are here. It is stroking my ego that you are here listening to us today, and that's going to be important.
And if you all go away, I shall be crushed. My whole self-worth shall be completely in ruins.
It will, because that's what ego is, right?
Yeah.
You know, I spend a lot of time in the coaching communities and the self-improvement communities. I think a lot of us do. The modern, even the modern quote unquote rationality community, groups like Less Wrong, for example. And a name that's been coming up a lot. I don't know why, but it's coming up over and over again in these threads, in these communities, on the Twitter space. All of this is Ryan Holiday. Now, Ryan Holiday is a guy who's written a lot of stuff I like. Ryan Holiday is known as today's advocate of Stoic philosophy. And a lot of times he does it in a good way. He's big on quoting, for example, Marcus Aurelius. You know, the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. Well, who could argue with that? Or, it is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. Marcus Aurelius was sharp, and Ryan Holiday is a good popularizer of the better side of Stoic. But the problem is, he is a philosopher, and he's a modern philosopher, and he's accepted a lot of things by default. So he put out a book, and again, I'm seeing it a lot. I know it's a couple years old, but he put out a book called Ego is the Enemy, and it's come up enough that we got to talk about this, because we need to know how to fight this, but also there may be something good and valuable in there. Might be a few things. Let's find out. Now, I want to hear from you in the chat as we go along. Bring the feedback. Also, let me know if you have read any of Ryan Holiday's books. He's published several. He sold 5 million copies of his books. How is this guy, a multimillionaire, selling Ego is the Enemy and The Obstacle is the Way? Well, The Obstacle is the Way is actually good Stoic advice if you know how to take it. 5 million copies. I haven't sold a single copy of my book, and the only obstacle I've got is that I haven't written it yet. That should not be enough to stop that from happening. So Ryan Holiday is a contemporary philosophy writer and a popularizer of Stoic wisdom. Now, he released Ego is the Enemy. It was a New York Times bestseller. As an admirer of Ayn Rand, you may not have known, but I am an admirer of Ayn Rand.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I am too.
So you can imagine this has
Amazing.
been a bit of a thorn in my side. So I decided to do my usual exploratory surgery on the book. And as usual, I strongly encourage you, in confronting volumes like this, find out what the author means. It's very easy to dismiss this, but in this case, Holiday acknowledges that there are multiple definitions of ego. And he goes on to write, and I'll quote him here in his book. The ego we see most commonly goes by a more casual definition: an unhealthy belief in our own importance, arrogance, self-centered ambition. It's that petulant child inside each person, the one that chooses getting his or her way over anything and anyone else. The need to be better than, more than, recognized for, far past any reasonable utility. That's ego. It's the sense of superiority and certainty that exceeds the bounds of confidence and talent. Well, he's really straddling the line there.
Well, he's really mucking it up, honestly.
Well, of course, you see a sense of superiority. Well, what if you really are, a little better than someone else? Or the beyond reasonable utility. Well, we're not utilitarians, so our self-confidence doesn't come from, gee, it would be handy to be confident. But let's take him at his word. So maybe he doesn't mean ego at all, not in the sense in which Ayn Rand defines ego.
Could be.
In a letter to the philosopher John Hospers, Ayn Rand writes, quote, "Man's ego is his mind. The most crucial aspect of egoism is the sovereignty of one's own rational judgment, and the right to live by its guidance. That sounds better. So Ryan Holiday goes on. If ego is the voice that tells us we're better than we really are, we can say ego inhibits true success by preventing a direct and honest connection to the world around us. So ego is this distorting force that apparently comes from our psychology. It makes us braggadocious. It makes us not just have a high opinion of ourselves, but an improper, inaccurately high opinion of ourselves. Recall the discussion we had about Sam Harris. Remember Sam Harris saying the self is an illusion. He claimed there is no such thing as the self. And I concluded during that discussion, one of Harris's two important errors is he regards all of us, me, you, all of us, as experiencing alienation from our true selves, as having this mind-body split, and even a mind-mind split, imagining ourselves detached from ourselves. In Amy's charming metaphor, it's like we're driving a transformer robot of ourselves, and there's the little real us is sitting in a little tiny chair in the back with a steering wheel.
Yes,
and
or
controls.
Gundam Wing. You hop into the robot, and
Yes.
or Ratatouille. The rat sits on your head underneath your chef hat.
Oh,
and
yeah,
controls
tells
you.
you what to do in Cyrano de Bergerac fashion, except in a kitchen. So Ryan Holiday goes on here, says, entitlement assumes, well, this is mine, I've earned it. At the same time, entitlement nickels and dimes other people because it can't conceive of valuing another person's time as highly as its own. It delivers tirades and pronouncements that exhaust the people who work for us and with us, who have no choice other than to go along. It overstates our abilities to others. It renders generous judgment of our prospects, and it creates ridiculous expectations. Now, unquote, that's obviously a thing that some people do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think that a lot of this stuff is, how, Gen X or however, people of a certain age, they razz on the millennials and the millennials razz on the Gen Z or whatever, it's just nonsense. But I think some people think to themselves, oh gosh, I'm part of Gen Z, and am I really entitled? Am I really, and I think they have concern about it, as they rightly should do, have concern about it, whether or not they're less resilient than their parents or their grandparents, and what that actually means for their lives, because somewhere, in them, they actually care for themselves. And I think that there is an interest currently in, what makes people go bad, what makes, trying to explain, as we, especially in objectivism, we always talk about, why is it that people are evil? How does evil happen? And I think in today's culture, they talk about things like narcissism, the entitlement, gaslighting, and they're trying to figure out, why people, what really makes bad people tick, and how they can avoid that, for their own self-protection. Except that in today's culture, most people still, their only reference to morality is altruism. And altruism, this, whether it's this irrational, range of the moment version of selfishness, or egoism and selflessness, it just isn't providing answers to people. And that's why people like Ryan Holiday is selling 5 million books, because he's asking some questions and people are interested, and there is interest in this question. Why is it that people are irrational, and what does that mean? And how can I protect myself from it? And how can I keep myself from turning into somebody like that?
So a rational analysis and judgment of what is earned matters. But does self-importance self-respect, require, or even imply minimizing the credit and praise and respect and admiration you have for other people. See, Holiday goes on here, quote from the book: ego needs honors in order to be validated. Confidence, on the other hand, is able to wait and focus on the task at hand, regardless of external recognition. With ego, we need to be recognized and we need to be compensated. Especially problematic is the fact that often we get that. We are praised, we are paid, and we start to assume the two things always go together. The expectation hangover inevitably ensues, unquote. Now, we've seen that before, but really, for reasonable people, does it? Do honors and awards and compensation and recognition imply a neurotic need?
I'd say no, and this is something that before you get into the John Boyd quote there, it's something, you know, this is something I've learned when I was managing some creative folks at my job, and I would give them praise and I would give them recognition. I would try to be specific with my praise and recognition, but some of them would reject it. They would reject the compliment, and then I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but I think that a lot of people don't see the reality basis in recognition. And as he's saying here, you know, he's saying, well, you know, if you have an ego, the ego is a bad thing to have. You should, number one, you shouldn't be accepting compliments. And it also obscures a person's thinking. It totally obscures a person's thinking about what are the standards for actually judging what a good job is, or what a good person is, or what good morality is. And it's really, really sad that most people, they can only refer to altruism when they talk about morality, because there's so much more to, as objectivists, we know this. There's so much more.
So one of the things that's being conflated here is the earned and the unearned. Mm-hmm. So I need to take a second to say one of the places they have definitely earned what they've got coming is the Ayn Rand Center UK. Mm-hmm. That's right. This is your reminder to support the Ayn Rand Center UK, the channel we're on, the folks we're working with, the folks you're listening to right now. If you put in a super chat, if you ask us a highlighted question, hit the little dollar sign there, put a few dollars on it. Anything you put in goes to the Ayn Rand Center UK. You can also support ARC UK by signing up at their website to be a member, aynrandcenter.co.uk. And finally, you can even become a member of their YouTube channel, which is totally separate, gives you access to the funny little icons and little perks on there as well. We've certainly done that. You should too. Now, the expectation hangover, this need for recognition, this neurotic need. If this sounds like it's got false alternative written all over it, here's a story. Here's a story that Ryan Holiday shares about John Boyd, who would tell his students, military students, he would say, Tiger, one day you're going to come to a fork in the road, and you're going to have to make a decision about which direction you want to go. And he would use his hands to illustrate. Boyd marked off these two directions. If you go that way, well, you're going to be somebody. You will have to make compromises, and you will have to turn your back on your friends, but you will be a member of the club, and you will get promoted, and you will get the good assignments. And then Boyd pauses to make the alternative clear. Or, he said, you can go that way, and you can do something for your country, and for your Air Force, and for yourself. If you decide you want to do something, now, you may not get promoted, you may not get the good assignments, and you certainly will not be a favorite of your superiors, but you won't have to compromise yourself. You will be true to your friends and to yourself, and your work might make a difference. To be somebody or to do something. In life, there is often a roll call, and that's when you will have to make a decision. Now, what I take away from this story is that Boyd was making a distinction between independents and second-handers. And then he included, along with doing something for your country and for your Air Force, doing something for yourself. See, Boyd at least doesn't accept the false alternative of self versus others. So Holiday writes this, again from the book. Imagine if for every person you met, you thought of some way to help them, something you could do for them, and you looked at it in a way that entirely benefited them and not you.
Whoops.
The cumulative effect this would have over time would be profound. You'd learn a great deal by solving diverse problems, and you'd develop a reputation for being indispensable. You'd have countless new relationships. You'd have an enormous bank of favors to call upon down the road. Well, that's what the Canvas strategy is about. Helping yourself by helping others. Making a concerted effort to trade your short-term gratification for a longer-term payoff. Whereas everyone else wants to get credit or be respected, you can forget credit. You can forget it so hard that you're glad when others get it instead of you. That was your aim after all. Let the others take their credit on credit while you defer and earn interest on the principal. Now, unquote. A lot of you are seeing through this right away. You're like, what? Wait a minute. If I'm producing something of value, in other words, if I'm able to help others, why is that not for my own sake? I mean, sure, I do a great thing and I sell stuff to people and they get a great product, but I get the money back. Or even when he talks about deferring the credit or deferring the returns, it's still just deferring them. They're still all coming back to you. So to answer this, I'm going to go back to Ayn Rand's letters to John Hospers.
Yeah, no, I just want to I got to have some questions here for you, if you don't mind, because a lot of us are seeing through this, and you've got all kinds of things in here that are just, like you said, well, let me ask you, why is Ryan Holiday presenting this? Is it for the purpose of trying to, like a thought experiment and trying to get people to put away or kind of like shove away their second-handedness and become more first-handed? That's like the most generous version of that. Or is he really trying to be an Ellsworth Toohey here and tell people to be selfless?
No, neither.
Okay.
He is trying to get people to think bigger, broader. It's interesting. There was a Q&A during the Certainty and Happiness lecture, and Leonard Peikoff was asked in the context of following principles versus being pragmatic. Maybe it was during Principles lecture. And he was asked, is the distinction being made here? Wow. Jeff Bannister has been giving out memberships.
5 of them.
That is so
amazing.
Cool in the chat. Sorry, I was distracted by that kind of awesome thing going on there. But
super
Leonard
cool.
Peikoff was asked by somebody in the audience, is the distinction here between pragmatism and being principled the short term versus the long term? And Leonard Peikoff made the point that pragmatism doesn't even work in the short term. And he gave a couple examples. And what I think the questioner was missing, and maybe this is how I would have answered it, it's not short-term, long-term, although that's a small part of it. It's short context versus broad context. It's taking the short term, but also the smaller, the trivial, the tunnel vision version of it. The what you get immediately, but also your smaller values in your hierarchy of values versus your broadest values. That's what Ryan Holiday is trying to address here. He may not even fully be able to put it that way, but we'll get to that by the time we're done.
Okay.
We really will.
And then I'll be able to rail against him. Totally.
Yeah, you will. But I don't want to lose the thread here because,
I understand.
Because there's a progression here. Again, Ryan Holiday ends this quote, let the others take the credit on credit while you defer and earn interest on the principal. You see what he's saying here? You do all of these things for other people and it will all come back to you. Cast your bread upon the waters and it will return to you manyfold, says the Bible. So to answer this, We only need to go back to Ayn Rand's letters to John Hospers. And here's what she's writing to John Hospers. Now, the extremely important issue of, quote, traditional egoism, unquote. You write, and this is John Hospers writing to her, traditionally, egoism has meant acting for one's self-interest only and ignoring the interests of everyone else, unquote Hospers. She goes on, then you describe the traditional egoist and ask me in what sense I call myself an egoist. Observe the description that you give. The traditional view of egoism is a description of Attila. It assumes that one judges one's self-interest by the narrowest range of the immediate moment, without any context, without any concern for past or future, for standards, principles, means or ends, without any reasons behind one's choices, actions, or decisions. It assumes that whim is the only standard of value and criterion of self-interest, and that an egoist is one who acts on his whims. This is the assumption I challenge. Then Ayn Rand goes on. An egoist is a man who acts for his own self-interest. This does not yet tell us what his self-interest is. On what ground is it then assumed that an egoist does or must judge his self-interest by the arbitrary whim of the moment? On what ground is it assumed that his interests are antagonistic to or incompatible with the interests of others? On what ground is it assumed that human relationships have no personal value to a man and that an egoist has to be indifferent to other human beings? On what ground is Attila supposed to represent the archetype of egoism? And why is Attila's view of self-interest taken as the view and the essence of self-interest? As you see, the traditional concept of egoism is a loaded, groundless, unwarranted, unjustifiable package deal, purporting to define only the basic motivation of a man, self-interest. It then proceeds to prescribe the specific concretes, allegedly representing man's self-interest, and thus substitutes the concrete values of Attila for the abstraction self-interest. I certainly maintain that an egoist is a man who acts for his own self-interest, and that man should act for his own self-interest. But the concept of self-interest identifies only one's motivation, not the nature of the values that one should choose. The issue, therefore, is what is the nature of man's self-interest? Since arbitrary desires, wishes, or whims are not a valid standard of value or criterion of self-interest, an egoist has to have a rational standard of value and a rational code of morality in order to be able to, in fact, achieve his self-interest. The traditional concept of egoism assumes that an egoist standard is, my self-interest consists of doing whatever happens to please me. A drunkard, a drug addict, a hot rod car driver are men who act on that standard. They could hardly be regarded as exponents of self-interest. A self-destroying, whim-worshipping neurotic is not a representative of the ego. In actual fact, he has neither self nor interests. And it is certainly not self-interest that he pursues or achieves. The traditional view of egoism, with whim as its standard, can thus be proved to be a contradiction in terms. Man's ego is his mind. The most crucial aspect of egoism is the sovereignty of one's own rational judgment and the right to live by its guidance.
Hear, hear.
Take that, Ryan Holiday. Now, there's more going on here than just getting egoism wrong, but that is really half the battle. And fortunately, Ayn Rand has already done the heavy lifting for us.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I'm going to mute for a second. Sorry about that. Okay. So I know you're watching the chat there. Do we have any questions we need to jump on?
No, not yet. Although we do have Apollo Zeus in for £2, and he says spam is great.
Spam is great.
That's a very objective statement.
If you're ever in the mood for a salty can of pork shoulder and other parts, you can't beat spam.
And thanks again to Jeff for $5.
He's
Canadian
also in the super chat besides buying everybody.
5 Ayn Rand Center UK memberships. Thank you so much.
Too
Really
cool.
sweet.
Now, you people who have never been members of the Ayn Rand UK YouTube channel before, If you click the emoji icon, you're going to see there are emoji there you've never seen before, or maybe you've seen other people use them, but they weren't available to you. Good fun for you. There will also be exclusives that are only available to YouTube channel members, and you get the extra icon there that says, "Hey, I'm a member. I'm cool, doing what the cool kids are doing." You know, in the introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of the Fountainhead, we talked about this many times, but this time I want to talk about a different aspect of this introduction. The introduction is practically one of the great essays of Ayn Rand in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But in regard to egoism, remember she wrote, "Are there any substantial changes I would want to make to the Fountainhead?" 25 years later. She says, "No, and therefore I've left it untouched. I want it to stand as it was written, but there is one minor error and one possibly misleading sentence, which I should like to clarify, so I shall mention them here. The error is semantic. The use of the word egotist in Rourke's courtroom speech, while actually the word should have been egoist. The error was caused by my reliance on a dictionary which gave such misleading definitions of those two words that egotist seemed closer than the meaning I intended." Now, you could answer a lot of what Ryan Holiday is saying in this book and sort it out and maybe get some value out of it just by using the word egotist in 95% of the places where he uses the word egoist or the word ego. From the text of the Fountainhead, part 4, I want to get a conversation with Peter Keating and Howard Rourke. And Peter Keating says to Rourke, "I know this is what you didn't want to mention. God, I didn't want you to mention it. I had to steel myself against it that night, against all the things you could throw at me, but you didn't. And if it were reversed now, and this were my home," remember, Keating is going to Rourke, asking for help, one last bit of help. He says, "Can you imagine what I'd do or say? You're not conceited enough." And Rourke answers him, "Why, no. I'm too conceited, if you want to call it that. I don't make comparisons. I never think of myself in relation to anyone else. I just refuse to measure myself as part of anything. I'm an utter egotist." And Keating says back to him, "Yes, you are. But egotists are not kind. And you are. You're the most egotistical and the kindest man I know. And that doesn't make sense." Well, maybe the concepts don't make sense. Maybe they don't mean what people have been taught to think they mean.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these concepts don't mean what Ryan Holiday thinks they mean.
Let me know when I can expound.
Oh, go right ahead.
Yeah, so in looking at all of this, and I know that what Ryan Holiday is saying in that one, he was talking about, and and you looked at it in a way that entirely benefited them and not you.
Yes.
And again, I see that more as I'm hoping anyway that is more of kind of a thinking challenge sort of thing rather than literal. Because if it were literal, it would be terrible. It would be awful. But the thing is that just the fact that he's piecing it together like he does, it really shows you that we have a lot of work to do as people who are interested in philosophy and objectivism and wisdom and applied philosophy. A lot of people don't understand that there is a third alternative to morality. The first one being altruism or intrinsicism, and the other one is subjectivism. And the entire corpus or the entire reference of morality that Ryan Holiday and all of so many people are taking from is coming from altruism. And again, altruism is basically it's an inept, half-baked moral code. It's a percentage of a moral code, a fraction, and it only answers who benefits, who gets the goods. It takes for granted how these values got here in the first place. It takes for granted who produced them. It takes for granted how a person, a human being, can actually produce them. What kind of mental work does it take to actually produce? And it completely ignores the value of Ayn Rand's 3 main values. And as she put it in Galt's speech and other of her writings, reason, purpose, and self-esteem. So it's completely ignoring the value of using reason, of planning for a self-directed, life-sustaining, and enhancing purpose, and the self-worth and pride that you earn from engaging with reality, irrespective of the values received from trading with other people. Ironically, altruism destroys relationships. It's so damned hell-bent and myopic about focusing on relationships, it completely misses the point of having them. And it starts a war, because, if you completely abandon all the other questions of morality and you're just left with who gets the goods, you're going to have a lot of conflicts right there from the start. So the way that, these folks, and I find this when I was reading Ryan Holiday, at least the quotes that Robert provided, was he's saying basically, like, it's childishly easy to achieve these 3 values of reason, purpose, and self-esteem, and as if the virtues of rationality are self-evident. They're not self-evident, and it takes a hell of a lot of work to be selfish. And for him to even imply in his thought experiment here that it would be just fine for you to just kind of, the only way that you earn anything in life, the only way that you can get merit points from, well, he doesn't want you to get merit points, but this thought experiment is just, what do you do if you're altruistic? You basically flail around and you try to help others blindly without finding what your values actually are. You don't discriminate between good and bad people. As long as you help them somehow. I mean, again, how can you help anybody else if you have no values of your own? If you have no self, how can you help anybody? And again, I mean, altruism only answers who benefits. It gives no thought to how you choose your actions, what is your nature, what your life requires, and the needs of your consciousness. The needs of your consciousness here, and we talk about spiritual values and objectivism, and those are self-esteem, pride, and visibility and recognition among other people, for based on actual values and actually valid, explicit standards that are life enhancing, or life affirming. So it's really sad seeing this kind of stuff.
Well, if you're looking for hope in that regard, there is a link.
Give me hope.
There is a link in the show notes. We've got more to say, and there will be take-home points. Believe me, I'm going somewhere with this. Mm-hmm. But there's a link in the show notes to an entry on Astral Codex 10, which probably half of the folks out there or more know is Scott Alexander's Substack, yes, the replacement for his old Slate Star Codex blog that got blown up when the New York Times refused to respect his anonymity. And his most recent entry is called Criticism of Criticism of Criticism.
So meta.
It's a critique of the critique of critiques of effective altruism.
Okay.
And it's funny, and he's a little cagey and coy, which I didn't think worked, which is why I'm giving the spoiler here. He refers to EA. And then he says, if you don't know what EA is, I'm not going to tell you, just imagine an X, like in algebra, just a placeholder. For some reason, he doesn't want you to know that what he's writing about is effective altruism and the effective altruism movement and the various organizations that have been created around effective altruism. And there is a reason to withhold that if you don't already know what he's talking about. I think it's more effective if you're not left wondering. So a link to that is in there. If you have any question about whether today's modern proponents of altruism are actually thinking about what they're doing and asking themselves questions about what they're doing, and whether perhaps a paradigm shift, in the language that Alexander uses, is coming in that regard, there's at least some hope to be found in the fact that an essay like this was written.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the essay? So he critiques
the critiques of the critiques.
Right, of the...
So there are people criticizing effective altruism.
Effective altruism.
Now, they're not doing a good job criticizing the premises, and I'm still looking for that, a person of Scott Alexander's intelligence. This is a guy who's much smarter than I am. I don't know what his IQ is, but he's really bright. And I would love to see him actually provide an essay on why is altruism the standard? The closest I've seen is the writings of people like Peter Singer, who basically got the ball off the ground with this, but I don't find his argument compelling. And I don't think that today's modern effective altruists even know his argument. They just take it for granted that helping other people is good and you should do a lot of it. And they're all common sense oriented people. They don't think you should sacrifice everything that you've got, the way somebody like Peter Singer would argue, in the name of altruism. In fact, the whole point of effective altruism is to say, well, if you just give away everything you've got, that won't do any good, because then you won't have anything left to give tomorrow. So that essay is worth reading, but I don't want to get too far off track here, because again, we're talking about Ryan Holiday and ego is the enemy. You know, back to the Fountainhead, there's a scene, again, in part 4, Gail Winan and Howard Rourke. Rourke climbed back on deck. Winan looked at Rourke's body, at the threads of water running down the angular plains. He said, "You made a mistake on the Stoddard Temple, Howard. That statue should have been not of Dominique, but of you." No, I'm too egotistical for that. Egotistical? An egotist would have loved it. You use words in the strangest way. In the exact way. I don't wish to be a symbol of anything. I'm only myself. Now, the reason I quote that from the Fountainhead is because I don't think this is a perspective that somebody like Ryan Holiday can understand at all. It seems to be for him either you're an egotist with that hard T, a false bravado and braggadociousness and a false sense of self-esteem, constantly building yourself up. You're either that, or you're a self-sacrificing altruist, which in his view will eventually come back to you. But this idea of somebody who is wholly independent, and it's not that Rourke doesn't like people or work with people or engage with people, they're just not primary to him. And he doesn't feel a need to be superior to them or recognized by them or buttered up by them. If that's not explicit enough, Ayn Rand wrote this in her journals. If you've got a copy of Journal of Ayn Rand, you may have read this. She was writing about the characters in the novel. And there's one character who you should, and you probably already have thought of when you think of, well, what's Ryan Holiday's idea of what an egotist is? Ayn Rand wrote this when she was defining her characters. Peter Keating, the exact opposite of Howard Rourke, and everything a man should not be. A perfect example of a selfless man who is a ruthless, unprincipled egotist in the accepted meaning of the word. A tremendous vanity and greed which lead him to sacrifice all for the sake of a, quote, brilliant career, unquote. A mob man at heart, of the mob and for the mob. His triumph is his disaster. He's left an empty, bitter wreck. His second-hand life takes the form of sacrificing all for the sake of a victory that has no meaning and gives him no satisfaction because his means become his end. He shows that a selfless man cannot be ethical. He has no self and therefore cannot have any ethics. So here's my question for you as we come up on the last quarter of the hour, because the question is there something valuable in this book? What is Ryan Holiday saying in this book that is of value and that is not already being said by objectivists?
And if it's in there, Robert will find it.
I've always said, you know, one of my purposes, one of my goals, one of my missions is to find the kernel of truth in well-loved Wu. So what is Ryan Holiday saying in this book that is of value that's not already being said by objectivists? And here are some of my take-home points. We do all too easily blame others for our problems, rather than taking ownership of the situation and control of our destiny. If you've seen in the objectivist movement, some folks who never really got around to being a Howard Rourke, to deciding what they wanted in life and going out and getting it, and who blame it on, well, society sucks, people are terrible, I can't get a decent job because everyone's irrational, and even if I did, I'd have to give half of my money away in taxes, and I refuse to do that, and I'm just not going to live a great life because, damn it, the world doesn't deserve me.
I've heard that so many times, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, Ryan Holiday would say also, we should practice seeing ourselves with detachment as an outside observer. Well, that kind of detachment is important, because what I take that to mean is, or at least the valuable takeaway for an objectivist, is to see ourselves objectively.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think objectivists are immune to either false bravado or false self-criticism. That's why I always remind people of Quint Corder's quote, "One doesn't deserve to be one's own harshest critic without also being one's most devoted fan." Now, that doesn't mean that you should swing manically from loving yourself to hating yourself, from having the crazy, crazy mania to self-loathing. No, what it means is you should be objective about yourself. That's why I say good is good, because most of the people I know are good, and that means something. You don't have to believe you are the greatest person since sliced people. That doesn't work, does it? All you need to know is that you are good, that you are moral. Hell, to be consistently moral is moral perfection. All right, here's another one. It is easier to talk about your work, to brag about your work, to rhapsodize about your work, than to do the work. Too much goal visualization can be confused in your mind with actual progress. Well, that I agree with 102%.
Absolutely.
One of the very first episodes we did of 5 Minutes with Robert Nasir and Amy Nasir.
Yes.
We talked about David Lee Roth's appearance on Debbie Millman's show, Design Matters. And he said in that episode, he said, be the verb. For example, it's not about calling yourself an author. It's about actually writing a book.
Right.
It's not about calling yourself an architect. It's about actually creating designs and producing things.
And the next step for Howard Rourke is to love the doing.
Love the doing.
Yeah.
So it's great to make a business card and, you know, put your name and the title you hope to have on it. But yes, as Apollo Zeus says in the chat, fake versus real. Yes. Let's see. Ryan Holiday. Impressing people is different from being impressive. Mostly, you know, look at the guy in the mirror. If you're impressed by him, because you know the truth, that's a good sign. And one of the notes from the book here, final one. When you're starting out, this is true for you young people, but also for older people changing careers or picking up a new career or a new hobby. When you're starting out, you're not as good as you think. You probably have an attitude that needs readjusting, and most of what you know is wrong. Now that sounds unnecessarily harsh, but
no, it's not.
It immediately brings to mind, what Ira Glass said during a radio show.
Yeah.
And he said this semi-impromptu, but it's become like an essay. And there are videos made of the radio show where he said it. And it was said very informally, but it's so important that, it's become a thing. In fact, people now call it the gap. You know, they gave it a title because it was such a great thing he said on his radio show. This is The Gap by Ira Glass. I'm going to read it. It's just one long paragraph. Nobody tells this to people who are beginners. I wish someone told me. All of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste. but there is this gap. For the first couple of years, you make stuff and it's just not that good. It's trying to be good. It has potential, but it's not. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, is still killer. And your taste is why your work disappoints you. A lot of people never get past this phase. They quit. Most people I know who do interesting, creative work went through years of this. We know our work doesn't have this special thing that we want it to have. We all go through this. And if you're just starting out or you're still in this phase, you got to know it's normal. And the most important thing you can do is do a lot of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week you will finish one story. It is only by going through a volume of work that you will close that gap, and your work will be as good as your ambitions. And I took longer to figure out how to do this than anyone I've ever met. It's going to take a while. It's normal to take a while. You've just got to fight your way through. So that's Ira Glass talking about the gap. So again, we'll go back to Ryan Holiday. When you're starting out, you aren't as good as you think. You have an attitude that needs to be readjusted. Most of what you know is wrong. Now that's unnecessarily harsh, but it can be, it's hyperbolic to make the point that a lot of us do get into a thing and say, I want to do good stuff right away. I want it to be worth it right away. I need that feedback of, yes, I can do this thing. Whereas if it's creative at all, and this doesn't just imply creative, writing or art or singing or music, but just any kind of real work, you're not going to be any good at the beginning. No matter how good a person, no matter how hard you're working. When I was in IT, I spent 25 years as a computer technician. When I was a field engineer and we would bring new employees in, the first month on the job, those first 4 weeks, they were useless. They were a burden. And the next 2 months, so call it the first 3 months, they were not a net asset. It took 6 months on the job for somebody to be worth something. And that's not because people were bad. They weren't great employees. They didn't bring anything to the table. It's the nature of work, of any good, hard, creative, interesting, compelling work. So I think Ryan Holiday is at least on the right track there.
Yeah, what's interesting though is that he doesn't seem to have a word for rational egoism.
No.
And what does he come close to? He tells us what not to do.
Well, I can answer that by giving you the quick summary here. How does the thesis of this book relate to Ryan Holiday's advocacy of Stoic wisdom? So here's what Ryan Holiday appears to be on a mission: to end or resolve irrational braggadociousness, cockiness, bluster, entitlement, need for validation, and false pride. He's also fighting purposeless hatred. How much hatred do we know people feel that is blind or not directed toward actually doing anything? Mm-hmm. Bitterness, resentment, false or misdirected blame, projection, fear, helplessness, passivity, hubris, ideas without works, ideals apart from action. Holiday is trying to fight all of that. And here's what he's trying to encourage. And again, takeaways for those of you, tell me if this works for you. What he appears to be trying to encourage, if you can read through again the challenging way he puts it: learning, training, growth, action, work, performance, productivity, engagement, cooperation, working with people, resilience, ownership, responsibility, graciousness, benevolence, and flexibility. The quote there would be, he says, be willing to compromise on everything except the principle at stake. And we talked before about people who say, oh, that's not my way of doing things. That's just not how I am.
Yeah, so he's trying to find his own reason, purpose, and self-esteem in there, at least implicitly.
Yes.
And I just hope that I hope people like this discover Ayn Rand, because she provides such an incredibly strong framework and,
yes.
and easy to grasp framework once you grasp it.
Yes. To
philosophically detect, to do the surgery, as you put it, Robert, and to say, okay, what are the essentials here? And so poor Ryan is kind of, I don't know. I think a lot of what he's saying is good, but it's not a clear, rational framework like a philosophy should be, like objectivism is.
Yes, he doesn't think you can get there directly. He doesn't think you can be larger than the moment, that you can be principled in that way and be an egoist. And sorry. Just
yeah. So
getting the
I can read your bottom line if you'd like.
So the bottom line, the takeaway for you, the kernel of truth, in addition to all of those missions that I just read off. Incidentally, I will be publishing this discussion after I edit it a bit as a Substack entry. So if you're not already receiving my Substacks, which have only been half a dozen, you won't get spammed, you won't get flooded with this, although Apollo Zeus likes spam. Bottom line, do be Howard Rourke. Don't be Peter Keating. Now, this isn't as easy as it sounds, which is why Ryan Holiday basically takes the Ben Shapiro approach. Well, if you're going to be selfish, if you're going to be self-interested, you're going to be at the bar picking up loose women, abandoning your children, nihilist, hedonist. It isn't as easy as it sounds, that's true. If it was, the Fountainhead would be a children's golden book, or elementary school primer. Now, fortunately, in addition to the Fountainhead, which is the model, we have objectivism, which is the instruction manual.
Good way to put it.
But, for tips and tricks beyond the instruction manual, read Ryan Holiday, but with a very filtered, discerning eye.
Yeah, well, you have to put on your Sherlock Holmes philosophical detection hat.
Yes. Now, incidentally, if you, well, maybe I could read this and get something out of it, but I don't want to buy this guy's book. I don't want to support that. The book is available through lending libraries. And the neat thing is you don't have to drive to the library like I did in order to read the book, because lending libraries are digital now. You can go to archive.org and borrow the book online and read it. That's, incidentally, if you go to my show notes at facebook.com/Robert Nasir, you will find a link to the archive.org version of the book. So again, the book has some value if you know what to take away from it. Unfortunately, you don't really have to read it now, because I've given you all of the value there is to be gotten.
Yeah, you just re-listen to this and you'll see my being very disheartened by the very first parts in these quotes that
as one should be.
As one should be. But in these contexts with this kind of self-help coaching influencer folks who are writing these books, I mean, there's going to be something in there, that perspective that you may not have thought of. And so go for it with your discerning eye, and don't get too upset when or too exasperated when all you see is them, touting altruism and bromides that they've learned they can't get away from because they haven't discovered Ayn Rand's morality of rational egoism.
Now, there might be a temptation, since objectivism, and Ryan Holiday doesn't, to think, I'm a better man than Ryan Holiday is. I know something that Ryan Holiday doesn't. He's a dope and I'm smarter than him. There's a kernel of truth to that, but read the book. This is not an idiot. It's like when we talked about Sam Harris, when we talked about Martha Beck, when we talked about Steven Pinker. We're not dealing with idiots here. We're dealing with people who have not got objectivism as their philosophic base. Take the value, ignore the hooey, get some good stuff out of it.
Yeah.
And let's talk about it on Clubhouse.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap up here. We're going to go over to Clubhouse. Yes, we will have a session on there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to those of you who did the super chat stuff. Put in a few dollars. Very much appreciated. Support the Ayn Rand Center UK in that way and by becoming a member if you're not already. Special thanks to Jeff, who again brought several people into the YouTube channel membership as well. A super cool thing to do. We appreciate you joining us. We will be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock UK time with James Valiant to discuss Leonard Peikoff essays on Leonard Peikoff Fridays. That's 3 p.m. in the afternoon for you on the Eastern time zone. And in the meantime, be good to yourself and have a nice life on Earth.